Hello again, I am Amarachi Ubani. The International Criminal Court has summoned South African authorities to explain why they failed to arrest Sudanese President Omar Hassan al-Bashir back in June when he attended a conference. That's the African Union Summit. President Bashir, accused of masterminding genocide in Darfur, was able to leave an African Union Summit in South Africa and fly home in defiance of a ruling by a court ordering his detention under a warrant from the ICC. South Africa is being summoned because it is a member of the ICC and therefore obliged to enforce warrants from the Hague-based tribunal. Now a look at what the crimes are against the Sudanese president is a genocide, which is killing members of the Fur, Masalit and Zagawa ethnic groups, causing these groups seriously bodily or mental harm, inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about these groups' physical destruction. He's also accused of crimes against humanity, which include murder, extermination, forcible transfer, rape, torture. Also facing the Sudanese president is attacks on civilians in Darfur, pillaging towns and villages, and many more. I'm being joined now by the former ICC prosecutor, Mr. Charles Adeogun Phillips. You're welcome to The World Today.
Thank you for having me.
All African leaders who attended the AU summit were given immunity. Why is the ICC asking South Africa to explain President al-Bashir's departure?
Well, South Africa is a state party of the Rome Statute of the ICC, and it has certain obligations under the statute, being a state member, a state party of the ICC, to comply with arrest warrants issued by the court. At the same time, South Africa is also a member of the African Union, and under the protocols and certain protocols between the African Union and various member states of the Union, those states tend to sign a safe passage agreement with the African Union when African leaders are required to attend African Union summits. And in this case, of course, the South African government would have executed such a safe passage agreement with the African Union, and therefore it's unable to arrest an African head of state in its territory.
Yeah,
so there is a conflict.
Yes, and I do understand that, because I was actually there at that summit. I spoke to a few of the leaders who said, why shouldn't Omar al-Bashir attend the African Union summit? After all, he is a guest of the African Union, and he's also a guest of South Africa. And being the venue for the African Union, then he's invited, and there's nothing South Africa can do about that.
That's absolutely correct. And that is not only unique to the African Union, as it were, it is also unique to a lot of international organizations and international courts and tribunals. For example, the 10 meter or 100 meter radius around the United Nations headquarters in New York is international territory. So is the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. What then happens in relation to summits is that the African Union executes safe passage agreements with the host country, in this case South Africa, to guarantee safe passage to all those who attend. So clearly, there is a conflict between peace and security in the world and the need for justice. That's just a clear example of that.
And do you think South Africa will respond to this summon by the ICC? I mean, the country is already considering pulling out of the international body.
This is not the first time that a sovereign state has been asked to explain its conduct by judges of the ICC. If you recall, President al-Bashir was in Nigeria for a summit, and a similar request was made by the judges of the ICC. So it's routine. South Africa will respond and would say that under their constitution, their membership and their agreement with the African Union perhaps overrides that of its obligations under the Rome Statute.
I'm thinking here that Omar al-Bashir may not ever be arrested. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this? Because it just seems like the ICC will continuously chase him, and countries which are members of the ICC, signatories to the International Criminal Court, will do nothing about it until he probably falls on, enters into one of the countries which probably have a problem with Sudan or with Omar al-Bashir before he's finally handed over to the ICC?
Well, this is international politics at play. As you well know, the African Union does have a problem with sitting African heads of state having to be charged before international courts. That is inherent in the ICC. As you know, there has been a resolution to extend the jurisdiction of the African Court on Human Rights to be able to deal with these cases. And the first thing that features in the jurisdiction of that court is the immunity of sitting head of state and their inability to be charged before the court. So clearly, there is an opposition on the part of the African Union as a body to bring heads of state, sitting heads of state, accountable for human rights violations during their tenure.
Mr. Adeogun, just one more question. You don't find it a bit strange that, because the ICC says most of these cases being brought against African leaders are being brought by Africans themselves. So for Africa to be saying we're not handing over our presidents, we're not handing over our leaders, it does sound like they're contradicting themselves.
Well, it's not so much a contradiction. I think what it is, I think the problem is with the tenure. I think the problem of the African Union is having sitting heads of state being brought to justice during the currency of their tenure as heads of state. They find that particularly objectionable. We've seen it in the case of Kenya. Thankfully, the charges against President Kenyatta were eventually withdrawn. And we see it again in the case of al-Bashir. There is no reason to suggest that once al-Bashir is no longer president of Sudan, he wouldn't be brought to justice, as we can see in the case of Hussein Habre, currently facing justice in Senegal.
So in the end, it's not a lost case after all.
No, it isn't. No.
Thanks again for joining us, Mr. Charles Adeogun Phillips, former ICC prosecutor. Thank you for joining us on Network Africa.
Thank you for having me.